Came here prepared to discuss the findings of one of my studies that looked at the impact that affirmative action bans have had on the representation of students of color in graduate studies, an area that has not been as well documented as undergraduate education. However, I am also, as my partner likes to call me, a recovering lawyer. And in this capacity is when I served as counsel of record in one of the briefs that Stella mentioned. It was a brief that was filed by 444 social scientists in support of the admissions policy that UT Austin is seeking to defend in the Fisher case. And this legal lens infiltrates my thoughts a lot. It informs the research questions that I ask. And as I listened to the presentations earlier in the day, I thought about this other important perspective that would help inform our discussion of diversity in higher education. And so I've shifted my presentation. Had a PowerPoint already for you, but now it's just notes that are hopefully coherent. And this perspective is about understanding the ways in which legal developments have shaped our discourse around diversity in higher education, right? And thinking about the implications of these developments for the kinds of policies that we implement as institutions that are looking to increase racial diversity in higher education. And I would argue that these legal decisions, these developments in the law, have created a divide between the goal of diversity and ideals for racial equity and educational quality. We know that early affirmative action efforts were focused on needing to address the racial inequities that were created by policies that enforce racial segregation and other kind of exclusionary laws. However, legal cases, and starting with the 1978 decision, the Bakke case, marked an important shift in these discussions around affirmative action that has had consequences for admissions policies that persist to this day. And what that case did is it required a shift in the focus of race-conscious policies away from compensating for racial wrongs or addressing ongoing discrimination toward a focus on promoting diversity. And by divorcing diversity-related policies from those that were intended to address racial and ethnic inequities, the case disconnected the goal of diversity from what I would call social realities, particularly in the ways in which structural ways continue to shape the way that race shapes educational opportunities, and also the implicit and subconscious ways in which race shapes identity, individual and collectively. What the case also did is it applied its strictest test under the Constitution, strict scrutiny, which essentially equated efforts to promote access for education for racial minorities with practices that could be potentially discriminatory against whites, right? So this was one of the first times that the court applied strict scrutiny test, which requires that you show a compelling interest and means that are narrowly tailored toward that interest, to policies that were implemented to include racial minorities, not those that were implemented to exclude racial minorities. And so by essentially equating efforts to advance equality for blacks and other marginalized populations with efforts that could be discriminatory against whites. That's what one of the things that the Bakke case did as well. And so we saw a shift from promoting access for racial minorities to the need to protect whites from discrimination. Now, the Grutter and Gratz cases out of Michigan ended up endorsing this notion of diversity being a compelling interest in education as well, and it even expanded it to not just think about it in terms of the benefits that it brings for learning outcomes for students, but also for the democratic goals of our society, in emphasizing that the path to leadership needed to be open to individuals across all races. But even as the rationale in Grutter connected racial diversity to institutional missions and democratic goals, it also endorsed what I call a false dichotomy between diversity and educational quality. One of the arguments that the university advanced in supporting, in seeking to defend its race-conscious policies, is that the university did not have to abandon selectivity as a core part of its mission in order to achieve racially diverse learning environments. The university did not question whether relying on standardized tests and admissions discriminated against racial minorities, nor did it propose to rely less on these measures to attain racial diversity. And what the court did is it agreed with this rationale, basically emphasizing that the university didn't have to choose between diversity and selectivity to further its interests. But in doing so, what this essentially created or enforced was a dichotomy between diversity and selectivity. And because selectivity is viewed as a proxy for educational quality, endorsing this division essentially endorses a chasm between diversity and educational quality. There are other groups that try to defend the policy on the grounds that it wasn't being used to create an exception to quality, but that it was needed to address the law schools or the undergraduate schools otherwise biased admissions criteria. But this wasn't the argument that was endorsed in the decision or the one that Michigan advanced. And so we see this in the discourse, this divide between our understanding of selectivity and diversity and what that requires. And we see in the public debate, as we can see through the implementation of all these bans, we have 8 states right now that ban affirmative action. And the various the discourses that separate the two sides in a way, and that is to think about the way that in which race-conscious policies are equated with reverse discrimination, right? So this portrays race-conscious efforts to increase racial diversity in post-secondary education as creating exceptions to merit, to otherwise unquestioned measures of quality. And I think from this perspective, racial diversity and equity are viewed as coming at the expense of merit and educational quality. And so the implications for institutions, from my perspective, is that to further racial diversity, institutions need to reframe the way these concepts of diversity, equity, and quality are viewed, or the way in which they're perceived and enacted through policies. And because decisions that are made at the point of entry, admissions policies, are so inherently connected to determinations of merit, of equity, of educational quality, these efforts need to focus on these admissions policies. And we need to reassess reliance on standardized test scores and admissions, which are measures that have been shown to be inadequate predictors of success across all racial groups, but especially for underrepresented students of color at undergraduate selective institutions as well as graduate programs. Essentially, if racial diversity is central to an institution's educational mission, then the measures that faculty administrators use to assess applicants' qualifications should be in the interest of racial diversity and the educational benefits that this brings to the student body.